I have basis to believe that high treason is taking place. And I have basis to believe that in higher echelon of Armenian government, there are several people who work not for Armenia, but for foreign, let's call it secret services or governments or whatever we call it.
Wow. Welcome to the Armenian News Network, Groong. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
This episode was recorded on November 13, 2023. We're happy to have with us Aram Orbelyan to talk about the 1991 Alma Ata Declaration, which Armenia and many other Soviet states signed on the eve of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Welcome back to our show, Aram. Great to talk with you.
Hi, Aram. Thank you for the invitation. Hi.
The 1991 Alma Ata Protocols were the founding documents for the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, and were signed on December 21, 1991. The founding of the CIS then led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26. A key argument or excuse that Pashinyan throws around as part of his "I didn't do it" defense in losing Artsakh is that by signing the 1991 Alma Ata Protocols, Armenia had already recognized Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. There has been a lot of confusion over what has been signed, what hasn't been signed, and what has been ratified, and what has been signed but not ratified by both Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, Aram, can you help us understand what First President Levon Ter-Petrosyan signed on behalf of Armenia and Alma Ata? And also, what did the legislatures of Armenia and Azerbaijan ratify and when?
Okay, so whenever we are speaking about Alma Ata Declaration and all the issues connected with the dissolution of Soviet Union and establishment of Armenia, I see a lot of discussion based on rumors. I see a lot of discussion based on personal belief of people what happened, and I see very little analysis of documents, official clarifications, declarations, and official materials, let's say that way. And that's kind of problematic. And everyone who is very much interested in Alma Ata Declaration, I would recommend to go on a website of Luys Foundation. About a couple of weeks ago, there was a very big publication prepared by Vartan Pogosyan, where he did in detail explore all the details. The document is in Armenian. I believe it would be also translated in English for deeper going into the topic. Now coming back to more specific issues. When the Soviet Union was being dissolved, there was so-called Belaveja agreements between, let's say, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, which still were part of Soviet Union. And then this document was finalized by an Alma Ata Declaration, where already more participants, let's say 11 participants took part. However, before that, there was also an agreement on establishment of CIS, which is basic document or charter of CIS and based on which CIS was created. And then 3 weeks later, Alma Ata Declaration was announced, let's call it that way. So now, whenever we come to the topics and about Alma Ata Declaration and CIS document, it's very important to go to the text and to understand what is the status of each of them and what does it mean from international point of view, international law point of view. However, before going there, we need really to understand what Soviet Union was. Was it a state? Was it a group of states? What was it, an international organization? And did Armenia, Soviet Russia, Soviet Azerbaijan has international statehood within Soviet Union or not? Whenever we answer to those questions correctly, the analysis of what happened in 1991 would be clearer, because from history books, whenever we read Armenian history, we speak about First Republic, Second Republic, and Third Republic. And one can have an impression that there was such a state as Soviet Armenia. However, from international point of view, international law point of view, there was no such a subject of law. There is no such a country as Soviet Armenia. There was only one participant, which was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had a little bit specific status because after Second World War, in addition to Soviet Union, Ukraine and Belarus were participants to UN. But still, the the subject of international law, the country which was participating in international relations, was Soviet Union, not Soviet Armenia, not Soviet Azerbaijan. So this is one point which is very important to take into consideration. Second issue which is very important to take into consideration, what happened to Soviet Union? Initially, everyone decided that Soviet Union fall apart to several countries. However, afterwards, quite many legal issues were risen because, for example, according to the UN Charter, there is a status of permanent member of Security Council, which was Soviet Union, and no one changed that text. However, you can see the Russian Federation being there instead of Soviet Union. So a concept of continuity of Russian Federation from Soviet Union was established. So from international law perspective, there was one country that was Soviet Union, which continued to be Russia. And all other countries became independent from Soviet Union. I mean, the three Baltic states declared about their occupation since 1939, but all others kind of declared about their independence from Soviet Union, and we're discussing about succession issues. Now, coming back to declaration. According to international law, whenever we are speaking about sources of international law, what does it mean? Whenever I want to say, okay, there is an international obligation, or we recognize something, or someone recognized us, or whatever, I need to make reference to some sources. For example, if we are speaking about criminal law, I would be sourcing in national law, I mean in domestic law, I would open a criminal code and say article whatever. Whenever we are speaking about constitutional law, I would say, oh, by the way, if you open a constitutional and article this, or a constitutional court decision, number whatever. Whenever we speak about international law, again, we need to make reference to specific articles to find out the content, to discuss about the content and what is there. So under international law, the sources would be international treaties, international customs, general principles of law, judicial decisions, and then, of course, additional source, which is not in original chapter documents, but that would be unilateral declaration of states, which may also create international responsibilities for states. So we have two different documents. One of them is treaty, and that is the document under which CIS was established. So 11 countries at that stage came together and said, by the way, we want to establish CIS. And CIS is going to be international organization. It's not going to be a state. It's not going to be a super whatever union which would have statehood. All the states members to CIS would be independent states. So that is already a stage where existing countries would come together to say, we want to create a union or whatever, international organization. Mm-hmm. So at that stage, there is an article which says that we recognize existing borders, and there is this wording which is Pashinyan throwing into the discussion. The similar wording is present also in Alma Ata Declaration, which is a declaration, not a treaty as such. So I just wanted to make sure there are two documents. One is a treaty, one is a declaration.
Okay.
So the treaty was being ratified by Armenian parliament, or at that stage Supreme Council, because the treaties are the documents which go through ratification. The declarations are declarations. So if you take as a declaration, it's more or less similar November 9 document. So it's an announcement, declaration, or whatever, not a treaty to undergo national procedures. So whenever the treaty was being ratified, there are two decisions of Supreme Council. One say, okay, we want to ratify, but before ratification, they appoint a council, or let's say one of the standing commissions, to develop necessary reservations. And one of the reservations was in that document, it's Article 10. Everyone can find that document in arlis.am, where all Armenian legal acts could be found. It's published document, it is there, which says that in addition to and then the document has an article that the union is open to all members of Soviet Union or all other countries who share the principles and goals of the organization to join the union, so CIS. And Armenia made a reservation to add there, including all the autonomous regions of Soviet Union who has declared their independence before the treaty was signed, and that is Artsakh actually, because Artsakh made their declaration of independence of December 10. That was before December 28. So this is one thing.
Aram, I think only Artsakh fit the description, correct?
That's true. But that's only Artsakh. But Armenia didn't say
Right.
all the states and Artsakh. He said general rule, which was logical, which was falling under international, let's call it jurisprudence. It was logical. It was following international law, and also it was following Soviet Union legislation, because it was allowing the autonomous regions, republics, oblasts, or whatever they were called, plus all the places of compact inhabitants of national minorities to declare about their independence whenever the bigger unit was declaring about their independence. So that's a declaration. Plus, whenever we go to declaration, the declaration doesn't have reservations because it is a declaration. However, the reservations were made to the treaty, which is showing exactly the position of Armenia about what was there. And now, when we come about to this specific wording, established borders, there are two very interesting elements, because Azerbaijan didn't participate in a procedure, not in a declaration, but in a treaty before 93. So Armenia didn't owe any obligation to Azerbaijan before 93 in general, because Azerbaijan joined the treaty only in 93. So in general, any wording in a treaty wouldn't be applicable between Armenia and Azerbaijan if we are speaking on relationship before 93. Whenever we are speaking about the wording which was there, I mean on a content, not only on temporal issues, but also on the content, it speaks about inviolability of recognized borders. So when we are speaking about recognized border, there should be some treaty on border, there should be some principle on border, and it couldn't be implied that Soviet internal borders between, let's call it republics or oblasts or subjects of whatever the federation or the unit was, could be recognized as international. So otherwise it would be telling that the states agree that the internal borders would be the state borders between independent states. This is not in the text. If this was the intent of the parties, that would be very explicitly stated in the document. It wouldn't be telling about recognized borders. And when we are speaking recognized borders, most likely it would be external borders of Soviet Union to the extent established, because not all the borders were fully delimited and demarked with whenever we are speaking about Soviet borders, because let's say Russia was doing as a procedure with China for long ago. So that's kind of the context. And now I want to bring several arguments showing or backing up the interpretation of the document I was just bringing up, I was discussing now. Firstly, let's take Russia-Azerbaijan relationship. Russia and Azerbaijan discussed their borders for more than 15 years. I think they started like sometime in 2000 and they finished sometime in 2016. I might be mistaken on 1 year maybe, but it took like 16 years for Russia and Azerbaijan to make a delimitation of their borders and delimitation and demarcation of their border. That is to identify the border between Azerbaijan and Russian Federation. And during this procedure, territory of Azerbaijan was increased by Russia giving some territories to Azerbaijan during this procedure. If it would have been a technical procedure using some headquarters, army headquarters map from, I don't know, head of staff of Soviet Union, that would have been a technical process, not a legal process, which would have taken 16 years. And in those 16 years, the parties would have been negotiating, discussing, finding a solution, moving in different directions, doing work on spot, etc. Armenia-Georgia border is not delimited to the end. Azerbaijan-Georgia border is not delimited, and there is a dispute connected to temple or a church on the border. So in reality, the practice explicitly shows that none of the parties took the Soviet borders for granted and say, oh, by the way, we recognize those borders. If this was the case, then all the parties would say, oh, the borders are there, we have recognized them, so we go ahead and discuss changing them, not establishing them. So this is the first argument. We see that all the union members or CIS members were discussing their borders with their neighbors. Some of them have finished, some of them are still continuing. This is one argument. Second argument is that, let's say, if 12 or 11 countries establishing a union, it doesn't mean they would say, oh, Artsakh, by the way, should be deprived of their statehood. So this could make clear clarity that Armenia would recognize Azerbaijan as a state, and we do recognize them as a state. We would recognize, and there is a big trap here, their territorial integrity, because recognizing territorial integrity means we agree not to use force, and we would not accept any changes in territory or political independence by use of force, because whenever we are speaking about territorial integrity, that is the only place where you can find these two words in UN Charter. That would be in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of UN Charter, where explicitly state that all states shall refrain from use of force or threat of force against territorial integrity or political independence, etc. So that is territorial integrity being used only in a context that it's forbidden to use force against it. So whenever we recognize borders, we recognize territorial integrity, it doesn't mean we recognize specific borders existing between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Because if this was the case, I repeat, the other states wouldn't be doing like long 10, 15 years procedures. They wouldn't spend so much money, resources, time just to find out where their border is. And the issue of Armenia-Azerbaijan discussions or negotiations would have been much simpler in the last 30 years. Because if it was the case, everyone in the international level would say, by the way, your borders are here. This is a document where your borders are. So you should not be doing anything. You just take and make borders and everything is settled. We wouldn't have Minsk conference. We wouldn't have Minsk group. We wouldn't have co-chairman of a Minsk group. We wouldn't have all this process, 30 years, different plans, different negotiations, which was taking place in reality. But everyone would come in and say, by the way, in Alma Ata, you recognized Azerbaijan and you recognized Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. So what do you want now? So this is very important to understand that in Alma Ata Declaration, nothing is telling that Armenia is recognizing any border between Armenia and Azerbaijan in a way that Pashinyan is trying to do.
Okay, so why would Pashinyan ignore these reservations?
I have two different approaches. First one, I have a basis to believe that high treason is taking place. And I have basis to believe that in higher echelon of Armenian government, there are several people who work not for Armenia, but for foreign, let's call it secret services or governments or whatever we call it. And I do not have any proof. I have basis to believe. And the basis to believe is one of those is that he is not using the reservations. He just brought in Alma Ata Declaration. Before that, that wasn't a part of a negotiations discussions.
Right.
If we look at what happened in Security Council when Armenia was claiming the issue of Artsakh, just a couple of hours before that, he made a statement that nothing is happening in Artsakh, or let's say there is nothing endangering the population of Artsakh. Again, several hours before the Minister of Foreign Affairs would be having speech in Security Council, and the Azerbaijani guys used Pashinyan's speech to rebut the speech of Armenian delegation and many other issues. Secondly, if this is not the case, I have another ground to believe that his political credo is that he doesn't like Artsakh. He wants to get rid of Artsakh, and that's the easiest way. And maybe let's call it that way. He firmly believed that by giving up Artsakh, he would do a favor for Armenia and Armenia will develop, etc. But again, I believe in first position more than on a second one. So because he is
could and a lot of people also bring up the explanation that he may be doing this under duress, and I want to understand what, if anything, does that reduce the charges of high treason? Does that change anything, any of the previous explanations that you provided, or is that a separate explanation of its own? Even though, I'm not sure, how much that can be proven that it's being under duress.
Two different point of view on the process. It's from criminal law point of view and from international law point of view. So from criminal law point of view, I can't think of duress in general. I mean, I just don't see it. I mean, because for duress, you need to have personal, let's say, to be afraid of your life in a personal capacity, not as a state. If we are taking into international law perspective, there are clearly all the actions done by this government in international discussions could be rebutted, and it's clearly there's very strong arguments that those are done under use of force, threat of use of force, let's say in Artsakh case also genocide, and several other breaches of public international law, which let's say makes the obligations taken by Armenia to be null and void. So the clear one is use of force, because Azerbaijan used force. Azerbaijan many times repeated that they will use force if Armenia doesn't agree. If we take that approach, that would mean that, let's say, if one day, I don't know, in 1 year or in 1 month or in 1 week, Armenia is in a position to stand for itself, then all these documents, all these procedures could become questioned, or let's say could be questioned, because it was done under use of force and threat of use of force.
Okay.
There are hostages in Azerbaijan. There is also genocide which happened in Artsakh, and then many other elements. So all this making the obligations taken by Armenian, even if it's done under high treason or not done in high treason, null and void. But for that, still we need to have a state. For that, we still need to have all the institution of a state functioning. You see, the biggest problem with all this is not only technically on international level, because you were asking why is he doing that. What I can follow in Armenia is regular destruction of state institutions, of public institutions, appointment of, let's say, non-professional staff in different positions. And that is another element which is making me believe there might be a high treason. So let's say for Armenian government to be able to establish a normal full-scale position on Artsakh, you need to have a normal functioning Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You need to have a normal functioning think tanks, let's say, institutions which can develop positions, concepts, participate in negotiations. Now, if you look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can see very strange appointments. You have Minister of Foreign Affairs who was accused of being a spy himself for Turkish government. And
well, he has clearly admitted to be a collaborationist with the Armenian National Security Service. But just to clarify that and to expand on that, so there's a statement from him signed that says that he is willing to provide information to the Armenian security services, and his nickname is Omega. But that is not conspiracy theory. That is something he himself admitted. What he has not admitted is that he cooperated with foreign entities. But there are experts who say that the form of agreements that they have on these people, what he has signed, is usually presented to people who have been essentially found collaborating with or found trying to be recruited by foreign agents, and therefore they have been included as the informant for the Armenian service, security services.
See, I tried to find a clear rejection on behalf of minister or ministry that he was never an agent of Turkey. I mean, just a very clear one-sentence statement that Ararat Mirzoyan was not and is not an agent of Turkey. I mean, that's one sentence, very clear. I never find it. I have a lot of text stating, oh, by the way, I was working for Armenian Secret Service because I was going and coming. And there is a huge text, but there is no clear statement denouncing him being a spy. I mean, or agent for Turkey. And that is giving me grounds to believe, coming back to my concept of high treason. Again, I don't want to discuss specific persons, but having all this, what's happening, having a minister who is discussing with Turkey, with Azerbaijan, having a ministry which doesn't have a normal international relations with any state, having a ministry which is appointing an ambassadors to such an important country, let's say, as United States, a political appointee, ex-minister of education, or sorry, culture. So all this makes me believe that we have issues either of high treason or complete incompetence, which is equal to high treason in this case.
Okay, well, I was actually, this was an interesting detour, and I want to go back to the Alma Ata Declaration because I have a few more questions. So, zooming back out, you said that the Alma Ata Declaration or the CIS Treaty defines or refers to agreement between existing states and existing state borders. So that implies that these states existed independently, maybe. Am I understanding that correctly? That the treaty itself implies that these states existed before the signing of the treaty or before the ratification of the treaty. And if so, essentially what I want to understand is legally, in international law, what is the founding date of the Republic of Armenia? And is a difference between the CIS treaty's signing date and the legal founding date of the Republic of Armenia of any relevance to the discussions around the state of Artsakh? Because as we know, in 1988, Artsakh and Armenia, and including Shahumyan, voted to, basically Artsakh and Shahumyan voted to be joined to Armenia, and the Armenian Council also approved it, or the Armenian equivalent of parliament. So did Armenia sign the CIS treaty as an independent state together with Artsakh and Shahumyan?
Okay. Now, to sign an international treaty, one should be a state. I mean, should be a subject of international law, and state is one of those subjects. I mean, you cannot sign an international treaty. Let's take a US example. Texas is not able to sign an international treaty. Alaska is not entitled to sign an international treaty. Only United States is entitled to sign an international treaty. Of course, those treaties could be applied only to one territory or another territory or all the territory, but still it's the state who is signing international treaty. So Soviet Armenia was not entitled to sign an international treaty. Soviet Union was entitled to sign an international treaty. So Armenians' birthday date is considered to be September 21. So that is a day when Armenia was declared. That's what we celebrate as National Day. And all the states of Soviet Union celebrate their day sometime in end of September, all this period. Yeah, so when all the states declare themselves being independent. So in Alma Ata in December, Armenia was already an independent state who was participating in that process, because otherwise it couldn't have signed an international treaty as such. However, there is this discrepancy because theoretically Soviet Union was still present on paper, but in reality it wasn't there anymore because the power of Soviet Union was we have like this 1-2 year period when all these issues, many issues were being still resolved, because in Armenia, for example, before end of 93 or second half of 93, we were still using Russian ruble or Soviet ruble actually. So from that perspective, this is kind of an interim period where there is no clarity, there is a lot of foam, like if in the water you would have, and then when everything is settled, every state would become an independent and is clear, all the procedures. Now, if we take an Armenian Declaration of Independence, so Armenian Declaration of Independence refers to 1989 unification decision by two Supreme Councils of Armenia and then that stage Nagorno-Karabakh, which declares those two units to be unified. So Armenian Declaration of Independence took a basis, and this declaration of unification or decision of unification is in the preamble as a basis, not as a goal, not as something which will happen in the past, but something which already has happened. This is declared it as a basis of independence, and Armenian independence was declared by Supreme Council, which was consisting of members of parliament, of members of Supreme Council, being elected by direct elections in the territory of Soviet Armenia and Soviet Artsakh, or Soviet Nagorno-Karabakh, let's call it that way. And that is the Supreme Council which declared independence. However, afterwards, in December 10, Artsakh became independent itself for whatever reason. I mean, there are different procedures, there are different, let's say, discussions why it happened. But in any case, in December 10, Artsakh also declared on their independence. Anyway, Armenia was independent in September 21, and it went to Alma Ata. In reality, already after what we see after Alma Ata Declaration and CIS Treaty ratification procedure, we claim that Artsakh should be an independent state, also member to CIS. That was the whole idea of that reservation, where we say all the states which has declared their independence before the treaty should be entitled to the membership to CIS. So that's kind of a procedure. And the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh at that stage, or Artsakh for today, was based both on international law and on Soviet legislation, if we consider the falling apart of Soviet Union being under the Soviet procedure under Soviet legislation, which was not the case, by the way. It was under international law, the country fell apart, and several countries appeared on that territory, and Artsakh was one of them. Anyway, so the dates are of importance, but even of more importance is when Soviet Union fall apart, how many states? In reality, factually, existing states with people, with territory, with government structure or governing bodies, and capable in participating in international relations. Those are elements of states under, let's call it, Montevideo Treaty or rights and obligations of states, or under general international law present. So in my opinion, at least 16, maybe 17, maybe 18, but at least 16. Because Artsakh has declared their independence already at that stage and had although partially was already occupied by Soviet/Azerbaijani forces, because it's again questionable when Azerbaijan was independent, when it was Soviet forces, when it was Azerbaijani forces, but still it was partially occupied. And they occupied afterward during the war in 94. It's signed armistice agreement as a separate party, not as, I don't know, part of Armenia, not as part of Azerbaijan, but as a separate party. So at least in 94, we can speak about three parties signing an armistice agreement. That would be Azerbaijan, and that stage Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, and Armenia.
Aram, I have a question about an interview that Levon Ter-Petrosyan gave at the time. I found a reference to it in the MediaMax article, which I'm linking to in our show notes. He gave this to Zerkalo Weekly and said, quote, "The autonomies of the Russian Federation would be the kind that would completely satisfy NKAO people," unquote. Do you think Ter-Petrosyan was talking about autonomy inside Azerbaijan, or about an independent or autonomous state member of the CIS?
Okay, there are two different factors we need to consider. Firstly, we need to remember that Yeltsin in Russia said every autonomous republic should take as much sovereignty as they want. So that was the period of falling apart of a big empire, and the procedure was continuing in Russia as well. I mean, people can recall Republic of Ichkeria, and then all Northern Caucasus republics were partially independent, non-independent. Tatarstan was in a procedure of discussing of independence procedure. So from that perspective, we could say, okay, autonomy within the Azerbaijan could be okay if we are speaking that they should take any autonomy as much as they want. That's one thing, because I am not specifically sure what they that was back in 90s, but still. The second argument is in 1998, if I am not mistaken, 3 different negotiations plans were published by Azerbaijan, which technically mean they didn't agree with any of them. Otherwise, usually you don't publish the plan or documents.
Alternatives, yeah.
The one was sole solution by package, another one solution by step, and third project was called common state. So according to that procedure, Azerbaijan and Artsakh would make one state. So Artsakh would be part of Azerbaijan. However, it would be something like federative states with quasi-equal relationship between Baku and Stepanakert, and with quite a lot of limitations of sovereignty of central government over the subject. So there shouldn't be Azerbaijani forces. So in practically something similar to Serbia-Montenegro after or during the Yugoslavia falling apart, which Azerbaijan rejected. It might be something like that, because if we are speaking about a common state where physically it would be called Azerbaijan, but the area would have such a high level of autonomy where, let's say, they would have their armed forces, they would have their police, they would have their language official one. So in practice, it would be a state within Azerbaijan. That could have been what Levon Ter-Petrosyan was meaning. I'm not sure. But still, any solution within Azerbaijan was step back and is dangerous, I will see, because technically we end up with a full genocide. Okay. And then I'm not speaking about what happened now, because technically some may argue that, okay, in early 90s, there was no such a level of hatred, and that Azerbaijan hasn't spent 30 years raising, let's say, generation-hating Armenians, because just, let's say, 5-6 years ago, before that, the massacres, in my opinion, genocide in Sumgait, Ganzak, Baku, and other territories of Azerbaijan and Artsakh has happened.
I think, to close, we have a few more questions on this topic. In its 33 years of de facto independence, self-determination, and self-government, no state has formally recognized Artsakh as an independent state. Of course, we have a lot of hindsight now, but looking back, should Armenia have recognized Artsakh as a state at some point during the past 3 decades? And if so, when?
Armenia's approach, should have Armenia done it or not, I'm having an issue, but I think there are 3 points where he could have done it. One was in 91. Technically, we could and should have recognized it as an independent state when the war was ongoing, or 91, 92, 93, somewhere in those periods. Or at that stage, even could speak about reunification and close the issue. Second point where I believe Armenia could and should have recognized it would be 44-day war. To the best of my knowledge, there were discussions to do it during the 4-day war before any escalation, and that was one of the topics why Azerbaijan was reluctant to move forward or continue the procedure, in addition to Armenian armed forces fighting back. But during 44-day war. The next instance was September 19, September 20, because when we are speaking about, let's say, people, human rights, and then you see the genocide, it's a place where you want to recognize. Something like similar to Kosovo, you and Armenia should have worked internationally to have a group recognition, which was possible, very difficult possible. But Armenia's approach, at least in early 90s, 2000s, was the following, that since I believe 92 Budapest decision, there was a decision that the conflict general should be solved in Minsk conference. So as a member of a Minsk conference, we do not want to predefine the possible decision of a conference, and negotiations are ongoing. So any action which would harm negotiations are counterproductive, so we should negotiate. So Armenia's position was that approach. So we don't want war, we want negotiations. We can negotiate for 100 years, but we need to negotiate in good faith to find a solution. But rather than undertaking any nice sounding action, which would make negotiations fruitless, something like Artsakh is shouting Artsakh is Armenia, and that's it in in Stepanakert by Nikol in 19. So this was the procedure. Armenia has recognized Artsakh as a state, but de facto, because we had an exchange with them. We were recognizing their judicial decisions. We were recognizing their internal documents. So in reality, there was this exchange, but that is de facto recognition rather than de jure final recognition as an independent state. Although there were some, let's call it protocols, agreements, which were regulating the procedures between two units. However, to which extent, to what documents, and some of them are confidential, some of them are classified, etc. But in general, this is how it works. So in my understanding, Armenia could most likely have done it in 91 when Artsakh declared their independence. We should say, okay, you are independent and we recognize you. At that stage, we were afraid. Maybe in 92, 93 negotiations procedure, maybe in 98 when it was clear that the negotiations, when those three plans were published by Azerbaijan. But in reality, I think the most strong position would be during the 44-day war, provided again that Armenia would have prepared diplomatic field or international field before that.
Aram, this may sound academic, but I think it's also important to ask. Since the complete dispossession of Artsakh in September 2023, where does it leave the cause of an independent Artsakh? Obviously, there are multiple angles to consider, political, legal, but what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, for me, it's also a very clear international question. Armenia should clearly not recognize the existing state and undertake all the actions to make sure that on international level, the existing state is not recognized, because the existing state was achieved through two grave breaches of international law. One is the use of force. A second one is genocide and crimes against humanity. I will bring a little bit different, but another example from international practice from Africa. South Africa had a mandate over Namibia. So at one stage, there was a decision that the South African mandate is terminated, so South African forces should be taken out from Namibia. South Africa didn't do it, and Security Council made a decision requesting all the states not to recognize the consequences of South African occupation of Namibia. So it's not completely the same situation, but then again, the forces were there, it was declared being illegal, and there is an advisory opinion of International Court of Justice which explicitly states any cooperation with South Africa should not cover Namibia. So if we take the Karabakh picture, it's a little bit different again, because at the moment I see, while Armenia, for whatever reason, maybe for those reasons which I was stating earlier, doesn't undertake any action, I see that the Azerbaijani government is making the following, inviting different ministers of foreign affairs who are entitled to speak on behalf of a state under international law, or head of government or head of state, and asking them somehow to declare that they were recognizing Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan from the beginning or from whatever stage. That kind of closing the possibility here. But Armenia would have now, we had a normal government, Armenia's position would be that on international level, we should be trying to get some kind of solutions which would request all the states not to recognize the existing state of Artsakh and not to undertake any action, any mining, any resource exploration, any development, any construction, any roadworks on the territory of Artsakh before the state is what was before the genocide and before the aggression would be recovered. This may sound a little bit utopistic, but this is really what the Armenian government, if it is an Armenian government, should be doing.
Right. First and foremost, that requires an Armenian government fighting for Armenian interests. Aram, thank you very much. I think we can go on forever talking about this because I don't believe the cause of Artsakh is a closed issue. So for today, I guess we will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us, Asbed and Hovik.
Thank you, Aramjan.
Talk to you soon. We were talking with Aram Orbelyan, who is an international law specialist. He's an attorney and managing partner at Concerned Dialogue Law Firm and a PhD in public international law. Dr. Orbelyan lectures at the Academy of Advocates of the Republic of Armenia and has lectured in public international law at French University of Armenia. Dr. Orbelyan was Deputy Minister of Justice of Armenia between 2011 and 2014. All right, that's our Conversations on Groong episode today. Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in our world-famous show notes. We'll talk to you soon.